Today I've got a Retina IIIc, small c, camera that's arrived from Australia for servicing. Now this one's a bit unusual in my latest lot of cameras I've had to deal with, because this camera's in quite good condition. It's very tidy. Everything appears to work quite well, with a couple of minor exceptions. Finder's a little bit cloudy, but no serious problems there. The only real problem with this camera is the shutter. And the shutter just doesn't work on the slowest speeds. You can see it's stuck open there. And the diaphragm blades are a little bit oily too. So the shutter certainly needs to be serviced. But the rest of the camera, I'm going to service that anyway. But it's not likely to be very entertaining. It really is going to be just stripped down, clean, reassemble with appropriate lubrication. And I'm not going to video the servicing of the camera body. I'll just video servicing the shutter, I think. Unless I strike something unusual. If I see something unusual and worth noting, I'll certainly record that. So, with that having been said, I'll strip this camera down, service the body. You probably won't see any of that, and then I'll come back and finish by doing the shutter and lens assembly. Well, as expected, servicing the body was a very straightforward matter. Nothing serious found at all. Simply a case of stripping it down, cleaning it, lubricating it, reassembling it, adjusting things as I went. No problems at all, really. Nothing much to report. There weren't lots of loose screws. There was not much in the way of dust and grit in there, virtually nothing. It was like an unused camera, really. Very clean. Anyway, that's all done. So I can turn my attention to the shutter, because that's where the work will be today. The shutter is just suffering from the usual problems that leaf blade shutters tend to suffer from. Oily blades. I'll just remove these shims from the back. Now we've got one paper shim there, I think, and a metal shim. They're quite oily, quite well stuck together. The lenses, usually the lens groups are just finger tight, the rear group. The front group, of course, bayonets in. And there's nothing obvious with those lenses, they all appear quite good. The shutter itself, it looks fairly unmolested to me. The lock screw for the retaining ring is not all scratched or scarred up. There are no slip marks from someone trying to undo the retaining ring with a tip of a screwdriver. So it's possible that this camera has never ever been serviced. That tiny black screw is very easily lost and very difficult to replace, because it's very easily lost and everybody's spares have long since been used up. The retaining ring, I'll just use a wooden toothpick to unscrew that. Lift the front rings off. And I can separate those for cleaning. There's not much to note there. It's not uncommon for this ring to be corroded, because it's a nickel plated steel. Most of the other stuff is aluminium, of course. That all looks pretty good. Okay, so here we have the shutter speed settings cam plate, and we'll just lift that off. We can take out this pinion, take out this little piece here. That's designed to stop you being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter is in the uncocked state. The shutter release lever can come out. This curved internal rack here can come out. This is driven by the pinion and cocks other parts of the mechanism. The mainspring, we can unhook that. Now the mainspring may or may not be quite tired looking. It is. The camera is obviously sat, I would say it's sat at in cocked for decades. That spring is very tired looking. The main cam, the retard gear train, 2 screws. That screw's loose. That's the be the first obvious fault I've found. That screw's loose too. Very interesting because screws in the camera body were not loose. Here's our retard gear train, we'll have that out. The self timer. Cock that part. This is the latch that holds the main cam in the cocked position. This screw here that holds that plate also holds the return spring for that little latch. Plain screw at this end. These other screws aren't loose. Interesting that the screws on the speed trains were loose. Plate should lift off. Moving flash contact. Release that mechanism that was cocked. That little lever can come out. Now I want to unhook this spring, so I'll put something behind the other end of that lever so that it doesn't swing back out of the way, and then I can stretch the spring out just a tiny amount to unhook it. Otherwise you're going to end up stretching that spring an awful long way out, chasing the lever trying to unhook it. Take out that pallet wheel. This screw has a spring on it which returns the settings lever for the flash sync speed and self timer, but the screw also holds down the B lever. This is the B lever. Have that out. The return spring for the B lever is on this post, and I'll unhook that. And there's one more small screw spring I want out of here, and that's right here on this lever. So I'll put a toothpick over the centre so that as I unhook the spring it can't disappear off into the wilderness. And that is as deep as we need to go with the front of the shutter. The next thing I need to do with the shutter is remove the outer shutter case. So we've got 3 screws, and I'm pleased to see that they are all present and correct. Now there's a screw here, a little tiny screw at the side. Now that's to keep the flash contact compressed, if you like, or in firm contact. I'll just back that off slightly. we'll take the outer housing off. Here's the curved pusher piece, and here's the curved rack. The curved rack is driven by the little pinion on the front of the camera. It pushes this, and this in turn pushes the cocking arm on the inside of the shutter. So now we're down to the base of the shutter, if you like, the case and the mechanism plate. To get this apart, with 3 screws here hold the diaphragm setting lever in place. The diaphragm action is a bit stiff. There's visible oil on the blades. Whether that oil is causing the diaphragm to be stiff or whether it's because of grease under here, it's hard to say. There's plenty of grease under there. There's the steel shim, that's very oily. Lift off this lever. This sets the self timer. It also sets the flash sync speed. We're down to the base here. I'll just check this diaphragm to see if it is stiff. It is, but it's not objectionable. It's got oil on it, but the stiffness was obviously from the setting lever rather than the diaphragm itself. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and the case together. These are not loose. Alright, let's see what we've got. Well, here's the case. Now the shutter here, you can see in the case here, all that marking. Now that's where those shutter blades have slid backwards and forwards over it. Now that's got a grey and dirty look to it. It may have been flood cleaned. That's where someone squirts solvent into the shutter and works it around a bit. Or if they're being a bit more subtle, they'll clean the blades with a cotton bud soaked in solvent. But this definitely looks to me like that those marks are marks from the shutter blades swinging backwards and forwards. They've got a silvery look to it. If it's been flood cleaned, graphite grease from elsewhere in the shutter has found its way into this position. If it hasn't been flood cleaned, then someone has probably squirted graphite powder in there. But there's no obvious sign of build-up of graphite powder anywhere. So it's a bit of a mystery. Anyway, we'll start with the diaphragm. I expect all those marks will go away when this is cleaned. I don't think there's scuff marks in the surface. I think that they are smears of graphite or graphite grease or something of that nature. Just lift that plate out. Yeah, it's quite marked. I'll just give that a clean now and we'll see what it looks like if I wipe a bit of naphtha across it. Yeah, it's definitely just dirty grey graphite or something on there. That cleans up immediately with naphtha, so no serious problem there. This is the same sort of deal, and here are the blades. Well, you can probably see the blades. They show an awful lot of staining where the blades are sat over the top of each other in a set position, and that silvery staining is not visible there. So what exactly has happened here, I'm not sure. Flood cleaning is certainly a possibility, and the alternative is that someone had put graphite in there. Here's the case. It's quite stained at the back here, dark grey, almost certainly graphite grease. Perhaps somebody lubricated this piece and then the lubrication moved. Difficult to say. Again, I don't see a great problem with that. I'm sure that'll clean up very nicely. Let's bring the mechanism plate into place. Let's have a look. The shutter blades are all correctly placed. They're all quite marked. It's an oil and it's that silvery finish too, which is almost certainly graphite. Hopefully they'll clean up well. I don't see any serious issues here. Here's the mechanism plate. Now this mechanism plate is very well greased up with graphite grease. It's also sticky with it. It hardly moves at all here. That's a serious problem. It's probably just down to too much grease and in the wrong places. Get the 3 retaining screws out. The retaining screws hold the lens tube to the mechanism plate. They also hold the little bracket here. It holds the tail of the main spring for the main cam. And the lens tube holds the blade actuating ring in position. And it's possible someone has just been so excessive with their application of graphite grease here that it has just transferred its way down past the blade actuating ring to the blades. That wouldn't explain how it got down to the diaphragm blades. So that's going to be one of life's mysteries. The shutter otherwise looked unmolested. So that's a puzzle. That would require that somebody who was very careful, very skilled in their work, had taken the shutter out, serviced it badly and put it back together again without leaving a trace. It doesn't really sound all that plausible to me. So I'm not sure what went on here. Perhaps there was just too much graphite grease on this mechanism plate right from the start. And perhaps the camera sat somewhere in a hot climate or in a hot condition or in a window or something of that nature where it got very hot and the grease melted and softened and ran elsewhere and caused grief. But either way, it'll all have to be cleaned up. I don't think I'm looking at any horror stories here. This one should be straightforward. I'll start with the shutter case. Usually the outside is the greasiest. In this case I think the inside is going to be the greasiest. Certainly see the stuff coming off. In the inside of the case. Now there's usually graphite grease on that little detent spring, so I'm not surprised to see that there. Right, one more round of cleaning of this I think and it'll be ready to go. That's nice and clean. Essentially it looks like a new part. So I'm not expecting any trouble cleaning the rest of these pieces. I think they'll clean up just as well as that did. It doesn't look like this camera ever did much work. We'll have a quick look to confirm that. Usually you can see scuff marks in the back, any camera that's done lots and lots of work. All I've got there is my greasy fingerprints on that pressure plate. But otherwise it looks pretty good. I mean, you know, it's not all scratched out in the film cassette well from having film cassettes bunged in it. It's generally pretty good. Some dirty mark there, I'm not sure what that is. It suggests that somebody was in there with dirty fingers. Probably the leftovers from somebody's holiday. Essence of hot dog or ice cream, who would know? This is cleaning up very well. You can see how much grease is coming off there, or graphite or both. When you're handling pieces like this, hold them by the edges. Your skin oils and perspiration will etch right into those surfaces. Probably etches into the edges too, but they're not doing anything particularly important for us. If you wanted to go over the top, you could wear finger cots or latex gloves or something of that nature. That looks fine. This plate I'd already given that a quick wipe on one side and the rest of it's cleaning up just as well. This does have a fingerprint on it. That's where somebody's grasped it in the factory, or if the shutter has been serviced, possibly when it was being serviced. It's also possible that the shutter had been partially serviced at some stage. That someone somewhat timid in their repair techniques opened the front, possibly cleaned the speed trains. That would explain the screws not being tight. Didn't delve into the shutter blades or the diaphragm blades, but gave them a puff of graphite powder or something or flood cleaned it. They don't really look flood clean. I suppose it's possible. One more round and I'll have this piece sparkling too, I think, or sparkling as it's going to be. One face, this face in fact, with the 5 small dimples, faces the shutter blades. And it needs to be nice and smooth and clean because the shutter blades have to whip across it at a great speed. This side faces the diaphragm blades, and the diaphragm blades do not move at a great speed. They only move as quickly as you're turning the knob. That's fine. These blades, they're interesting. Yeah, you can see that on the camera. They're funny, they're zebra striped almost, with oil and graphite. I'll clean these with some naphtha and show you the difference.